Is it a problem, though, that you don't have the big lobbies behind you of the fossil fuel lobbies? It's not seen as a particularly sexy fuel, is it? So when the choice comes for a government to invest in a biofuels power station or go nuclear, it's a no-brainer.
I don't know that it's a no-brainer anymore. I think suddenly we're sort of not quite looking so hard at nuclear, thank God. But the EU, China, India are looking very hard at biomass to energy across the range of technologies. South America, North America, New Zealand, most other countries. Australia is a little bit behind the game because there's been a lot of political blockage with conservation groups, etc., but we'll catch up before too long.
What are the problems with conservation groups?
It's a little bit what you were saying. There are some conservation groups that are assuming that any native forest harvest residue allowed to be burned and turned into energy will open the floodgates, and before we know it, we will have no standing forests, and etc. The same thing hasn't happened, obviously, in Scandinavia or other parts of the world. It's possible to have tight guidelines on all of that sort of thing, but these are groups that really don't trust politicians or don't trust the forestry industry, and sometimes with good cause, historically justified. But the future is a matter of, what do you want your energy to come from? Do you want it to keep on coming from coal, or do you want it to come from the range of renewables? And out of the renewables, bioenergy, hydro and geothermal are the three that are base load, that are on demand. And bioenergy, biomass to energy, is the only one that is able to produce substitute transport fuels and substitutes for petrochemicals.
One other point that's occasionally made about biomass is that, it affects the biodiversity of certain countries, because some trees grow faster, they're more economical to plant in vast quantities, and as a result, you destroy whole native populations of other trees. I think in Wales, for example, they've planted lots of pine trees and destroyed the original flora and fauna. How do you get past that? Because presumably there are some trees that are far better to grow, more economical, and as a result, you wipe out native forest populations.
There has been an uncontrolled amount of that sort of thing, and northern England, Scotland, Wales is an example, Ireland, but in a lot of other parts of the world there are enough guidelines that have been in place long enough that it has never started. It's a matter of striking the balance. In Australia we've cleared 90 million hectares of country, and as a farmer we are involved in replanting on 10% of our farm. And so that has meant we have got biodiversity back in place of the lower biodiversity of grasslands. And so we have kangaroos where we haven't had kangaroos before for 100 years. And so there is a balance in there, and it's just a case of providing people with the information and the good guidelines and maybe helping them with other incentives.
And in terms of the scale of stations, I know you mentioned a couple of minutes ago some large ones in China, but is biomass more suited to microgeneration, or can it work on all scales?
Basically, biomass to energy can work on all scales. So the biggest in Scandinavia might be up towards 500 megawatts of electricity output. Not quite that much, but up towards that, 250 to 450. And the smallest would be pellet-fired wood heaters in households in Austria, which would be 2 kilowatts, which is tiny. And so everything in between, from heat to heat and electricity, and the possibility of having very high efficiency. And so in Durban you could have a small power plant, 10 megawatt output, fueled by urban waste wood, all the trashed up pallets and the prunings off trees and the trees that fall down, dried, put through a chipper, feeding this thing, and providing you're using the heat, you would have an efficiency of use of that energy in the wood of something between 85 and 90%. And so this is what you find all through Scandinavia, Northern Europe, and increasingly in other parts of the world.
All right, and finally, what sort of regulations need to be in place to ensure that voracious forestry companies don't go around the world chopping down forests just in search of a quick buck to fuel some countries' sort of desire for a low carbon biofuel?
Yeah, it is a danger, and China, Japan, Korea, Europe, of course, their demands for biomass for power stations and etc. are growing annually. The the brakes on that is what WBA is also working on, which is a very tight set of criteria for sustainability of the sourcing and of the management of forests. And so anybody who is transporting biomass internationally, whether it's as chip or as pellets, has to be able to, or ideally the importers would make sure that that biomass complied with this range of criteria, and that would in itself stop an abuse of forests, because it's looking after the rights of indigenous people as well as habitat and as well as water and so on.